Hi, welcome back to Bedtime with Bruce. I am Bruce. Um, we are in the middle of three books, not in the middle, but we're involved in three different books right now. And we've gotten some feedback from some of our viewers who have kind of said that it's a little confusing that we're reading three books and we're in the middle. So, what we've decided to do, because as you probably know, I have not been enjoying our homoerotic book. Not specifically because of its content, but because it's just difficult to read, and I'm not having fun with it, and I'm sorry to say that. But what we've decided to do is just finish it. We're going to finish each book before we move on. So we're going to pick up The House of the Vampire, and we're going to finish it tonight. And tomorrow night we're going to pick up The Great Gatsby, and we're just going to read The Great Gatsby, and we're not going to do anything but The Great Gatsby until we're finished with that. And then we're going to finish the Secret of Black Oaks, and we're going to power through that, and then at that point we will be finished with all of our books, and we will start one book at a time after that. We're going to make some changes over the next few shows. We're going to finish out these books. We're going to read one book at a time. We're going to have different forums. We're going to talk about issues and what's going on in the world. We're gonna kind of open the forum up a little bit. But we're getting hits from all over the world. Someone from New Delhi in India came on tonight. Hello, New Delhi. Thank you all for watching our show and supporting us. I'm having fun with it. But like I said, watch for some format changes coming up. It's time to jump in. When we last left off, Ethel was trying to save Ernest. Ernest was the boy. Ernest is entranced by Reginald. I believe Reginald is the vampire. Ethel knows it. She's going to confront Reginald. She's pretty much asked Reginald to let Ernest go. Reginald's not into doing that. That's where we're going to start. So we're on chapter 20. They were sitting in a little Italian restaurant where they had often, in the old days, lingered late into the night over a glass of Lacrimae Christi. But no pale ghost of the past rose from the wine, only a wriggling something with serpent eyes that sent cold shivers down her spine and held her speechless and entranced. When their order had been filled and the waiter had posted himself at a respectful distance, Reginald began, at first leisurely, a man of the world. But as he proceeded, a strange exultation seemed to possess him. From his eyes leapt the flame of the mystic. "You must pardon me," he commenced, "if I monopolize the conversation, but the revelations I have to make are of such a nature that I might well claim your attention. I will start with my earliest childhood. You remember the picture of me that was taken when I was 5? She remembered, indeed. Each detail of his life was deeply engraven on her mind. At that time, he continued, I was not held to be particularly bright. The reason was that my mind, being preeminently and extraordinarily receptive, needed a stimulus from without. The moment I was sent to school, however, a curious metamorphosis took place in me. I may say that I became at once the most brilliant boy in my class. You know that, to this day, I have always been the most striking figure in any circle in which I have ever moved." Ethel nodded assent. Silently watching the speaker, she saw a gleam of the truth from afar, but still very distant and very dim. Reginald lifted the glass against the light and gulped its contents. Then, in a lower voice, he recommenced. "Like the chameleon, I have the power of absorbing the color of my environment." "Do you mean that you have a power of absorbing the special virtues of other people?" she interjected. "That is exactly what I mean." "Oh!" she cried. For in a heartbeat, many things had become clear to her. For the first time she realized, still vaguely, but with increasing vividness, the hidden causes of her ruin, still more plainly the horrible danger of Ernest Fielding. He noticed her agitation, and a look of psychological curiosity came into his eyes. "Ah, but that is not all," he observed smilingly. "That is nothing. We all possess that faculty in a degree. The secret of my strength is my ability to reject every element that is harmful or inessential to the completion of myself. This did not come easily to me, nor without a struggle. But now, looking back upon my life, many things become transparent that were obscure, even to me at the time. I can now follow the fine-spun threads in the intricate web of my fate, and discover in the wild wilderness of meshes a design awful and grandly planned." His voice shook with conviction as he uttered these words. There was something strangely gruesome in this man. It was thus that she had pictured to herself the high priest of some terrible and mysterious religion, demanding a human sacrifice to appease the hunger of his god. She was fascinated by the spell of his personality, and listened with a feeling not far removed from awe. But Reginald suddenly changed his tone and proceeded in a more conversational manner. "The first friend I ever cared for was a boy, marvelously endowed for the study of mathematics. At the time of our first meeting at school, I was unable to solve even the simplest algebraic problem. But we had been together only for half a month when we exchanged parts. It was I who was the mathematical genius now, whereas he became hopelessly dull and stuttered through his recitations, only with a struggle that brought the tears to his eyes. Then I discarded him. Heartless, you say? I have come to know better. Have you ever tasted a bottle of wine that had been uncorked for a long time? If you have probably found it flat. The essence was gone, evaporated. Thus it is when we care for people. Probably, no, assuredly, there is some principle prisoned in their souls or in the windings of their brains, which, when escaped, leaves them insipid, unprofitable, and devoid of interest to us. Sometimes this essence, not necessarily the finest element of a man or a woman's nature, but soul stuff that we lack, disappears. In fact, it invariably disappears. It may be that it has transformed in the process of their growth. It may also be that it has utterly vanished by some inadvertence, or that we ourselves have absorbed it." "Then we throw them away?" Ethel asked, pale but dry-eyed. A shudder passed through her body, and she clenched her glass nervously. At that moment, Reginald resembled a veritable prince of darkness, sinister and beautiful, painted by the hand of a modern master. Then, for a space, he again became the man of the world. Smiling and self-possessed, he filled the glasses, took a long sip of his wine, and resumed his narrative. "That boy was followed by others. I absorbed many useless things, and some that were evil. I realized that I must direct my absorptive propensities. This I did. I selected well. And all the time the terrible power of which I was only half conscious grew within me." "It is indeed a terrible power," she cried, "all the more terrible for its subtlety. Had I not myself been its victim, I should not now find it possible to believe in it. The invisible hand that smites in the dark is certainly more fearful than a visible foe. It is also more merciful. Think how much you would have suffered had you been conscious of your loss. Still, it seems, even now to me, that it cannot have been an utter, irreparable loss. There is no action without reaction. Even we, must have received from you some compensation for what you have taken away. In the ordinary processes of life, the law of action and reaction is definitely potent, but no law is without exception. Think of radium, for instance, with its constant and seeming inexhaustible outflow of energy. It is a different thing to imagine, but our scientific men have accepted it as a fact. Why should we find it more difficult to conceive of a tremendous and infinite absorptive element? I feel sure that it must somewhere exist. But every phenomenon in the physical world finds its counterpart in the physical universe. There are radium souls that radiate without loss of energy, but also without increase. And there are souls, the reverse of radium, with unlimited absorptive capacities. Vampire souls, she observed with a shudder, and her face blanched. No, he said, don't say that. And then he suddenly seemed to grow in stature. His face was ablaze, like the face of a god. In every age, he replied with solemnity, there are giants who attain to greatness which by natural growth no men could have ever reached. But in their youth, a vision came to them, which they set out to seek. They take the stones of fancy to build them a palace in the kingdom of truth, projecting into reality dreams, monstrous and impossible. Often they fail, and tumbling from their airy heights in a quixotic career, some succeed. They are the chosen. Carpenters' sons they are, who have laid down the law of the world, for millenniums to come, or simply Corsicans, before whose eagle eyes have quaked the kingdoms of earth. But to accomplish their mission, they need a will of iron and the wit of 100 men. And from the iron, they take the strength, and from 100 men's brains, they absorb their wisdom. Divine missionaries, they appear in all departments of life. In their hands is gathered today the gold of the world. Many potentates of peace and war. They unlock new seas, and from distant continents lift the bars. Single-handed, they accomplish what nations dared not hope. With Titan strides, they scale the stars, and they succeed where millions failed. In art, they live, the makers of new periods, the dreamers of new styles. They make themselves the vocal sunglasses of God. Homer and Shakespeare, Hugo and Balzac. They concentrate the dispersed rays of 1,000 lesser luminaries in one singing flame that, like a giant torch, lights up humanity's path. She gazed at him open-mouthed. The light had gone from his visage. He paused, exhausted, but even then he looked the incarnation of a force no less terrible, no less grand. She grasped the immensity of his conception, but her woman's soul rebelled at the horrible injustice to those whose light is extinguished, as hers had been, to feed an alien flame. And then, for a moment, she saw the pale face of Ernest staring at her out of the wine. Cruel, she sobbed. How cruel. What matter, he asked. Their strength is taken from them, but the spirit of humanity, as embodied in us, triumphantly marches on. Reginald's revelations were followed by a long silence, interrupted only by the officiousness of the waiter. The spell once broken, they exchanged a number of more or less irrelevant observations. Ethel's mind returned again and again to the word he had not spoken. He had said nothing of the immediate bearing of his monstrous power upon her own life and that of Ernest Fielding. At last, somewhat timidly, she approached the subject. You said you loved me, she remarked. I did. But why then? I could not help it. Did you ever make the slightest attempt? In the horrible night hours, I struggled against it. I even implored you to leave me. Ah, but I loved you. You would not be warned, and you would not listen. You stayed with me, and slowly, surely, the creative urge went out of your life. But what on earth could you find in my poor art to attract you? What were my pictures to you? I needed them. I needed you. It was a certain something, a rich color effect, perhaps. And then, under your very eyes, the color that vanished from your canvases reappeared in my prose. My style became more luxurious than it had been, while you tortured your soul in the vain attempt of calling back to your brush what you irretrievably lost. Why did you not tell me? You would have laughed in my face, and I could have not endured your laugh. Besides, I always hoped until it was too late that I might yet check the mysterious power within me. Soon, however, I became aware that it was beyond my control. The unknown God whose instrument I am had wisely made it stronger than me. But why, retorted Ethel, was it necessary to discard me like cast-off garment, like a wanton who had lost the power to please? Her frame shook with the remembered emotion of that moment when years ago he had politely told her that she was nothing to him. The law of being, Reginald replied, almost sadly. The law of my being. I should have pitied you, but the eternal reproach of your suffering only provoked my anger. I cared less for you every day, and when I had absorbed all of you that my growth required, you were to me as one dead, as a stranger you were. There was between us no further community of interest. Henceforth, I knew our lives must move in totally different spheres. You remember that day when we said goodbye? You mean the day when I lay before you on my knees, she corrected him. That day I buried my last dream of personal happiness. I would have gladly raised you from the floor, but your love was utterly gone. If I am tenderer today than I am wont to be, it is because you mean so much to me as a symbol of my renunciation. When I realized that I could no longer even say the thing I loved from myself, I became hardened and cruel to others. Not that I know no kindly feeling, but no qualms of conscience lay their prostrate forms across my path. There is nothing in life for me but my mission. His face was bathed in ecstasy. The pupils were luminous, large, and threatening. He had the look of a madman or a prophet. After a while, Ethel remarked, "But you have grown into one of these master figures of the age. Why not be content with that? Is there no limit to your ambition?" Reginald smiled. Ambition! Shakespeare stopped when he had reached his full growth, when he had exhausted the capacity of his contemporaries. I am not yet ready to lay down my pen and rest. And you will always continue in this criminal course, a murderer of other lives? He looked at her calmly in the face. I do not know. Are you the slave of your unknown God? We're all slaves, wire-pulled marionettes. You, Ernest, I. There is no freedom on the face of the earth, nor above. The tiger that tears a lamb is not free. I am not free. You are not free. All that happens must happen. No word that is said in vain is raised no hand. Then Ethel retorted eagerly, if I attempted to wrest your victim from you, I should also be the tool of your God? Assuredly, but I am his chosen. Can you not set him free? I need him a little longer, then he is yours. But can you not, if I beg you again on my knees, at least loosen his chains before he is utterly ruined? It is beyond my power. If I could not rescue you, whom I loved, what in heaven or hell can save him from his fate? Besides, he will not be utterly ruined. It is only a part of him that I absorb. In his soul are chords that I have not yet touched. They may vibrate one day when he has gathered new strength. You, too, would have spared yourself much pain had you striven to attain success in different fields. Not where I had garnered the harvest of a lifetime. It is only a portion of his talent that I take from him. The rest I cannot harm. Why should he bury that remainder? His eyes strayed through the window to the firmament, as if to say that words could no more bend his indomitable will than alter his changeless course of the stars. Ethel had half forgotten the wrong she herself had suffered at his hands. He could not be measured by ordinary standards, this dazzling madman whose diseased willpower had assumed such uncanny proportions. But here a young life was at stake. In her mind, she saw Reginald crush between his relentless hands the delicate soul of Ernest Fielding as a magnificent carnivorous flower might choose its glorious petals upon a fly, close its glorious petals upon a fly. Love, all-conquering love, welled up in her. She would fight for Ernest as a tiger cat fights for its young. She would place herself in the way of the awful force that had shattered her own aspirations and save at any cost the brilliant boy who did not love her. Okay, I'm understanding it a little bit more now. We're on to chapter 22. The last rays of the late afternoon sun fell slanting through Ernest's window. He was lying on his couch in a leaden, death-like slumber that, for the moment at least, was not even perturbed by the presence of Reginald Clark. The latter was standing at the boy's bedside, calm, unmoved as ever. The excitement of his conversation with Ethel had left no trace on the chiseled contour of his forehead. Smilingly, fastening an orchid of an undefinable purple tint in his evening coat, radiant, buoyant with life, he looked down upon the sleeper. Then he passed his hand over Ernest's forehead, as if to wipe off beads of sweat. At the touch of his hand, the boy stirred uneasily. When it was not withdrawn, his countenance twitched in pain. He moaned as men moan under the influence of some anesthetic, without possessing the power to break through the narrow partition that separates them from death on one side and from consciousness on the other. At last a sigh struggled to his seemingly paralyzed lips, then another. Finally the babbling became articulate. "For God's sake," he cried in his sleep, "take that hand away." And all at once the benignant smile on Reginald's features was changed to a look of savage fierceness. He no longer resembled the man of culture, but a disappointed, snarling beast of prey. He took his hand from Ernest's forehead and retired cautiously through the half-open door. Hardly had he disappeared when Ernest awoke. For a moment he looked around like a hunted animal, then sighed with relief and buried his head in his hand. At that moment a knock at the door was heard, and Reginald re-entered, calm as before. "I declare," he exclaimed, "you have certainly been sleeping the sleep of the just." "It isn't laziness," Ernest replied, looking up rather pleased at the interruption. "But I've a splitting headache." "Perhaps those naps are not good for your health." "Probably, but of late I have frequently found it necessary to extract from the day hours the sleep which the night refuses me. I suppose it's all due to indigestion, as you have suggested. The stomach is the source of all evil. It is also the source of all good. The Greeks made it the seat of the soul. I have always claimed that the most important item in a great poet's biography is an exact reproduction of his menu. True, a man who eats a healthy beefsteak for breakfast in the morning is incapable of writing a sonnet in the afternoon. Yes, Reginald added, we are what we eat, and what our forefathers have eaten before us. I ascribe the staleness of American poetry to the griddle cakes of our Puritan ancestors. I am sorry we cannot go deeper into the subject at present, but I have an invitation to dinner where I shall study experimentally the influence of French sauces on my versification. Goodbye, au revoir. And with a wave of the hand, Reginald left the room. When the door had closed behind him, Ernest's thoughts took a more serious turn. The tone of light bantering in which the preceding conversation had taken place had been assumed on his part. For the last few weeks, evil dreams had tortured his sleep and cast their shadow upon his waking hours. They had ever increased in reality, in intensity, and in hideousness. Even now he could see the long, tapering fingers that every night were groping in his windings of his brain. It was a well-formed, manicured hand that seemed to reach under his skull, carefully feeling its way through the myriad convolutions where thought resides. And oh, the agony of it all! A human mind is not a thing of stone, but alive, horribly alive to pain. What was it those fingers sought? What mysterious treasures, what jewels hidden in the underlayer of his consciousness? His brain was like a human gold mine, quaking under the blow of the pick and the tread of the miner. The miner, the miner! Ceaselessly, thoroughly, relentlessly, he opened vein after vein and wrestled untold riches from the quivering ground. But each vein was a live vein, and each nugget of gold a thought. No wonder the boy was a nervous wreck. Whenever a tremulous, nascent idea was formulating itself, the dream hand clutched it and took it away, brutally, severing the fine threads that bind thought to thought. And when the morning came, how his head ached. It was not an acute pain, but dull, heavy, incessant. These sensations, Ernest frequently told himself, were morbid fancies. But then the monomaniac who imagines that his arms have been mangled or cut from his body might as well be without arms. Mind can annihilate obstacles. It can also create them. Psychology was no unfamiliar ground to Ernest, and it was not difficult for him to seek, in some casual suggestion, an explanation for his delusions. The fixed notion that haunted him day and night. But he also realized that to explain a phenomenon is not to explain it away. The man who analyzes his emotions cannot wholly escape them, and the shadow of fear, primal, inexplicable fear, may darken at moments of weakness the life of the subtlest psychologist and the clearest thinker. He had never spoken to Reginald of his terrible nightmares, coming on the heel of the fancy that he, Ernest, had written The Princess with the Yellow Veil, a fancy that, by the way, had again possessed him of late. This new delusion would certainly arouse suspicion as to his sanity in Reginald's mind. He would probably send him to a sanitarium. He certainly would not keep him in the house. Beneficence in itself, all other things, his host was not to be trifled with in any manner that interfered with his work. He would act swiftly and without mercy. For the first time in many days, Ernest thought of Abel Felton. Poor boy. What had become of him after he had been turned from the house? He would not wait for anyone to tell him to pack his bundle. But then that was impossible. Reginald was fond of him. Suddenly, Ernest's meditations were interrupted by a noise at the outer door. A key was turned in the lock. It must be he, but why so soon? What could have brought him back at this hour? He opened the door and went out into the hall to see what had happened. The figure that he beheld was certainly not the person he expected, but a woman, from whose shoulders a theater cloak fell in graceful folds. Probably a visitor for Reginald. Ernest was about to withdraw discreetly when the electric light that was burning in the hallway fell upon her face and illuminated it. Then, indeed, surprise overcame him. "Ethel!" he cried. "Is it you?" All right. Chapter 23. Ernest conducted Ethel Bradenberg to his room and helped her to remove her cloak. While he was placing the garment upon the back of a chair, she slipped a little key into her handbag. He looked at her with a question in his eyes. "Yes," she replied, "I kept the key, but I had not dreamed that I would ever again cross this threshold." Meanwhile, it had grown dark. The reflection of the street lanterns without dimly lit the room, and through the twilight fantastic shadows seemed to dance. The perfume of her hair pervaded the room and filled the boy's heart with romance. Tenderness long suppressed called with 1,000 voices. The hour, the strangeness and unexpectedness of her visit, perhaps even a boy's pardonable vanity, roused passion from its slumbers, and once again wrought in Ernest's soul the miracle of love. Her arm encircled her neck, and his lips stammered blind, sweet, crazy, and caressing things. "Turn on the light," she pleaded. "You were not always so cruel. No matter, I have not come to speak of love." "Why then have you come?" Ernest felt a little awkward, disappointed as he uttered these words. What could have induced her to come into his rooms? He loosened his hold on her, and she did as she asked. Sorry. How pale she looked in the light, how beautiful. Surely she had sorrowed for him. But why had she not answered his letter? Yes, why? "Your letter?" She smiled a little sadly. "Surely you did not expect me to answer that." "Why not?" He had again approached her, and his lips were close to hers. "Why not? I have yearned for you. I love you." His breath intoxicated her. It was a little like a subtle perfume. Still she did not yield. "You know, you love me now. You did not love me then. The music of your words was cold, machine-made, strained, and superficial. I shall not answer," I told myself. "In his heart he has forgotten you." I did not then realize that a dangerous force had possessed your life and crushed in your mind every image but its own. I don't understand. Do you think I would have come here if it were a light matter? No, I tell you. It is a matter of life and death to you, at least as an artist. What do you mean by that? Have you done a stroke of work since I last saw you? Yes, let me see. Surely, magazine articles and a poem. That is not what I want to know. Have you accomplished anything big? Have you grown since this summer? How about your novel? I have almost finished it in my mind, but I have found no chance to begin with the actual writing. I was sick of late, very sick. No doubt of it. His face was pinched and pale, and the lines around the mouth were curiously contorted, like those of a man suffering from a painful internal disease. Tell me, she ventured, do you ever miss anything? Do you mean, are there thieves? Thieves. Against thieves one can protect oneself. He stared at her wildly, half frightened in anticipation of some dreadful revelation. His dream, that hand, could it be more than a dream? God! His lips quivered. Ethel observed his agitation and continued more quietly, but with the same insistence. Have you ever had any ideas, plans that you began without having strength to complete them? Have you glimpses of vocal visions that seem to vanish no sooner than see? Did it seem to you as if some mysterious and superior will brutally interfered with the workings of your brain? Did it seem to him, he himself could not have stated more plainly the experience of the last few months. Each word fell from her lips like the blow of a hammer. Shivering, he put his arm around her, seeking solace, not love. This time she did not repulse him, and trustingly, as a child confides to his mother, he depicted to her the suffering that harrowed his life and made it hell. As she listened, indignation clouded her forehead. while rising tears of anger and of love weighed down her lashes. She could bear the pitiful sight no longer. "Child," she cried, "do you know who your tormentor is?" And like a flash, the truth passed from her to him. A sudden intimation told him what her words had still concealed. "Don't, for Christ's sake, do not pronounce his name," he sobbed. "Do not breathe it. I could not endure it. I shall go mad." All right. Very quietly, with difficulty restraining her own emotion so as not to excite him further, Ethel had related to Ernest the story of her remarkable interview with Reginald Clark. In the long silence that ensued, the wings of his soul brushed against hers for the first time, and love, by 1,000 tender chains of common suffering, welded their beings into one. Caressingly, the ivory of her fingers passed through the gold of his hair and over his brow, as if to banish the demon eyes that stared at him across the hideous spaces of the past. In a rush, 1,000 incidents came back to him, mute witnesses of a damning truth. His play, the dreams that tormented him, his own inability to concentrate his mind upon his novel, which hitherto had ascribed to nervous disease, all piling fact on fact, became one monstrous monument of Reginald Clark's crime. Excuse me. At last, Ernest understood the parting words of Abe Felton, and the look in Ethel's eye on the night when they had first linked his fate with the other man's. Walkham's experience too, and Reginald's remarks on the bust of Shakespeare and Balzac unmistakably pointed toward the new and horrible specter that Ethel's revelation had raised in place of his host. And then again, the other Reginald appeared, crowned with the lyric wreath. From his lips golden cadences fell, sweeter than the smell of many flowers or the sound of a silver bell. He was once more the divine master whose godlike features bore no trace of malice and who had raised him to a place very near his heart. "No," he cried, "it is impossible. It's all a dream, a horrible nightmare." "But he has himself confessed it," she interjected. "Perhaps he has spoken in symbols. We all absorb to some extent other men's ideas without robbing them and wrecking their thought life. Reginald may be unscrupulous in the use of his power of impressing upon others the stamp of his mastermind. So is Shakespeare. No, 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 you are mistaken. We were both deluded for the moment by his picturesque account of a common, not even a discreditable fact. He may himself have played with the idea, but surely he cannot have been serious. And your own experience, and Abel Felton's, and mine, can they too be dismissed with a shrug of the shoulder? But come to think of it, the whole theory seems absurd. It is unscientific. It is not even a case of mesmerism. If he had said that he hypnotized his victims, the matter would assume a totally different aspect. I admit that something is wrong somewhere, and that the home of Reginald Clark is no healthful abode for me, but you must also remember that probably we are both unstrung to the point of hysteria. But to Ethel, his words carried no conviction. "You are still under his spell," she cried anxiously. A little shaken in his confidence, Ernest resumed. "Reginald is utterly incapable of such an action, even granting that he possessed the terrible power of which you speak. A man of his splendid resources, a literary Midas at whose very touch every word turns into gold, is under no necessity to prey on the thoughts of others. Circumstances, I admit, are suspicious, but in light of the common day, this fanciful theory shrivels into nothing. Any court of law would reject our evidence as madness. It is too utterly fantastic, utterly alien to any human experience." "Is it, though?" Ethel replied with particular intonation. "Why, what do you mean?" "Surely," she answered, "you must know that in the legends of every nation we read of men and women who were called vampires. They are beings, not always wholly evil, whom every night some mysterious impulse leads to steal into unguarded bedchambers to suck the blood of the sleepers, and then, having waxed strong on the life of their victims, cautiously to retreat. Thence comes it that their lips are very red. It is even said that they can find no rest in the grave, but return to their former haunts long after they are believed to be dead. Those whom they visit, however, pine away for no apparent reason. The physicians shake their wise heads and speak of consumption, but sometimes ancient chronicles assure us the people's suspicions were aroused, and under the leadership of a good priest, they went in solemn procession to the graves of the persons suspected. And on opening the tombs, it was found that their coffins had rotted away, and the flowers in their hair were black, but their bodies were white and whole, though no empty sockets crept the vermin, and their sucking lips were still moist with a little blood. Ernest was carried away in spite of himself by her account, which vividly resembled his own experience. Still, he would not give in. All this is impressive, I admit. It is very impressive. But you yourself speak of such stories as legends. They are unfounded upon any tangible fact, and you cannot expect a man schooled in modern science to admit as having any possible bearing upon his life the cruel belief of the Middle Ages. Why not? She responded. Our scientists have proved true the wildest theories of medieval scholars. The transmutation of metals seems today no longer an idle speculation, and radium has transformed into potential reality, the dream of perpetual motion. The fundamental notions of mathematics are being undermined. One school of philosophers claims that the number of angles in a triangle is equal to more than 2 right angles. Another propounds that it is less. Even great scientists who have studied the soul of nature are turning to spiritism. The world is overcoming the shallow skepticism of the 19th century. Life has become once more wonderful and very mysterious. But it also seems that, with miracles of the old days, their terrors, their nightmares, and their monsters have come back in a modern guise. Ernest became even more thoughtful. Yes, he observed, there is something in what you say. Then, pacing the room nervously, he exclaimed, and still, I find it impossible to believe your explanation. Reginald a vampire. It seems so ludicrous. If you had told me that such creatures exist somewhere far away, I might have discussed the matter, but in this great city, in the shadow of the Flatiron Building, no. She replied with warmth, yet they exist, always have existed, not only in the Middle Ages, but at all times, in all regions. There is no nation but has some record of them in one form or another. And don't you think if we find a thought, no matter how absurd it may seem to us, that has ever occupied the minds of men, if we find, I say, such a perennially recurrent thought, are we not justified in assuming that it must have some basis in the actual experience of mankind? Ernest's brow became very clouded, and infinite numbers of hidden premature wrinkles began to show. How wan he looked, and how frail. He was as one lost in a labyrinth in which he saw no light, convinced against his will, or rather, against his scientific conviction, that she was not wholly mistaken. Still, he observed triumphantly, your vampires suck blood, but Reginald, if vampire he be, preys upon the soul. How can a man suck from another man's brain a thing as intangible, as quintessential as thought? Ah, she replied, you forgot. Thought is more real than blood. Okay, we are at chapter 25. I'm going to take a quick break, and I will come back, and we will finish this book once and for all. All right, I'll be back. Stay with me.